welcome to the third Canon Club event, and thanks to everyone who's come here. Tonight we have an innovation. We're going to go downstairs afterwards and have a drink or two, so if anyone wants to join for further discussions, I think that adds the sociability of it. So we're going to have a 45-minute talk on Coleridge, and then there'll be like a quick break, we can go have a drink, and then there's questions, which normally last like half an hour, 45 minutes afterwards. So anyway, tonight we welcome Professor Douglas Hedley to talk about Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who is a poet, but also a theologian, a philosopher, a very important critic as well, and a political thinker as well. Douglas Hedley is Professor of the Philosophy of Religion and Fellow of Clare College at Cambridge. He's an expert in Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy and has written a number of books, including Coleridge, Philosophy and Religion, Aids to Reflection, and The Mirror of the Spirit. I hope I got that right. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he's probably one of the only poets I can actually recite in any mainly, I'd say, from listening to Iron Maiden as a teenager. When the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner was turned into a sort of 13-minute epic song on their Power Slave album, for those who don't know you. But, I mean, they're not alone. Probably, I looked up, did some deep research on Wikipedia for this, and that poem, which is best known as well as Could Be Calm, is probably the most referenced of any in popular culture. It appears it's referenced in various films, novels, computer games, and this goes back as far as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and to his own time, their contemporaries and friends. Every time one of us talks about when we talk about someone or something being an albatross, we are referencing Coleridge. So even though the point of my Canon Club, the Canon Club idea was that we wanted to fill in bits of a knowledge we are all lacking, he is one poet who has still has a cultural influence on us, but I'm sure we're all here to learn more. I also have a slight personal connection, not personal connection, but he died in Highgate, close to where I live, in I think a house now owned by Kate Moss, which is worth about £15 million. And my second child was baptised at the church where he's buried, St Michael's, and so I feel a bit of an affinity there. I believe he's buried in the wine cellar. I don't know if that's correct, but underneath. And my children all attended a primary school which was named Coleridge after him, although for how much longer? Renamed after someone. He's also, Professor Hedley's going to talk about his politics a lot. He's also the exemplar of someone who was a young radical who became increasingly conservative and reactionary as he got older, and all the optimism was sucked out of his life. And I believe at Cambridge he burned liberty and equality into the grass using gunpowder. But as the French Revolution developed, he became increasingly what we now call right wing. He also planned a utopian community, I believe, with Robert Southey, which was going to be called the Pantisocracy, which is a terrible name. He was a theologian and he was a preacher. At times for a while, was Unitarian, who was sort of the most radical of the dissenting groups, before returning to the Church of England as it became more conservative. And his conservatism, I suppose, we'll get onto this, but I suppose it's now what we call sort of more communitarian or paternalistic. He had this idea of a clerisy who would rule over society in a kind of benevolent way and instruct people's moral values, and he very much objected to the job stockers, I think was the word he used, the people that, the kind of conservatives who are only interested in money and sell everything, although I think he was also quite terrible financially himself, but he was a poet, so. Perhaps relevant to the Canon Club, he was also fearing that culture and literature would become more and more degraded and sort of lowbrow, and the sort of culture generally was becoming stupider. So, at least it shows that those fears have always been around. And he gave talks himself for 10 years. I think he lectured, particularly Shakespeare. He was a very influential figure in Shakespeare criticism, which his talks are apparently famous for sort of complete digressions and sort of lack of preparation. But he also had a very tortured personal life and problems with addiction and laudanum and alcohol. But we expect that of a romantic poet. And his life was, in many ways, very long. It wasn't short, but it was in many ways quite sad and tragic and tortured. But he remains one of the most influential figures in poetry in England, and I'm ready to scratch the surface, and here's Professor Hedley to explain it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. There's a wonderful 20th century work by a great German philosopher, Rudolf Otto, called The Holy. And the key idea of the holy is described by Otto through a Latin tag, the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. And this idea of the tremendous mystery that is both appealing and terrifying is what Otto thinks is distinctive for this sense of the holy, which Otto was a comparative religionist, a great scholar of Sanskrit, and he looked at various cultures and saw evidence of this sense of the sacred, with this awareness of the numinous, possessing both this fascinating but also terrifying aspect as a central phenomenological fact of human experience. And he refers explicitly to this poem with the subtitle, A Vision in a Dream, a fragment. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea, so twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round. And there were gardens bright, with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests, ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as air beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermittent burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. Amid these dancing rocks at once and ever it flung up momently the sacred river, 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion. Through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And mid this tumult Kubla heard from afar ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain of the caves. It was a miracle, a rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw, it was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song? To such a deep delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. So that's the great seminal poem of the sacred that Otto is using as his instance of this sense of the sacred that is both terrifying and attractive. Now, opinions about Coleridge as a thinker have been divided ever since his lifetime. A slothful, pusillanimous dreamer in whom sincerity, if it ever existed, had been destroyed by the use of laudanum. And of course, Kubla Khan is a poem that Coleridge explicitly associates with his opium. Now, of course, there were many more positive assessments of Coleridge as a thinker, from James Marsh in Vermont, who in America edited Coleridge's work Aids to Reflection, which became very important in North America. And indeed, in Britain, figures like Owen Barfield, and indeed C.S. Lewis himself, were deeply influenced by Coleridge. I once went to the library of Lewis near Chicago in Illinois, Wheaton College, where they have Lewis's library, at least a replica, and his copy of Byron has a very short remark to the effect, I've read enough of this, and his copy of Coleridge's Aids to Reflection is fully annotated. Now let me give you a report of a brilliant contemporary of Coleridge's, Henry Crabb Robinson. Now, he was a man who knew the great Germans of the period. So Crabb Robinson knew Goethe, knew Schiller, knew Herder, Schelling, so all the greats of that era of German genius. And in his diary, he writes about Coleridge, whom he met through Charles Lamb. And this is what he writes about Coleridge. He kept me on the stretch of attention and admiration from 3:30 to 12 o'clock, on politics, metaphysics, and poetry, more especially on the Regency, Kant, and Shakespeare. He was astonishingly eloquent. Though Robinson felt a, quote, sense of inferiority that makes me humble in his presence, I do not feel in the least afraid of him. Although he did note that he thought Coleridge would never succeed at the bar. So, who was this figure who, through his poetry, embodies what Otto calls this sense of the sacred, this figure who was recognized as a genius in his own age by Crabb Robinson and many others? Well, he was born in Ottery, St. Mary. His father was a vicar and the headmaster of the local grammar school. And his father dies in rather tragic circumstances. This is a typical Coleridgean story. So the little Sam was the spoilt youngest child in the family. And at breakfast once, he was quarreling with his older brother, Frank, and in the heat of the moment picked up a knife and threatened his older brother. And at this point, the idea was, oh, well, something has to be done about this. So the father takes Frank off to the port to send him off as young men often were, at a very young age at the time. And then the father comes home and dies. And poor Sam had this deep feeling of guilt that he was the one who was responsible for his father's death. And of course, Frank, his older brother, then dies a few years later in service in India. So this sense of guilt as well in Coleridge is a very profound aspect of his psyche. Anyway, he attends Christ's Hospital, so he's sent off to this school that was really set up for the orphans of the clergy. And after Christ's Hospital, where he's a very capable Grecian, so he's one of the cleverer boys, and then he goes to Jesus College, Cambridge. Now, Jesus at the time was a centre of radicalism, particularly a hotbed of Unitarianism, which was problematic in Cambridge at the time because it was not respectable to be a Unitarian, and so Coleridge left university and then is supported by Unitarians and particularly by the Wedgwood families, and he the period of much of the great poetry is when he was in Somerset with William Wordsworth, whom he met in 1793, and that is one of the great seminal friendships, I think, in English literature, this symbiotic relationship between Coleridge and Wordsworth. 1798, they go to Germany, and then this was extremely important for Coleridge, less so for Wordsworth, and partly because Coleridge learnt German. And this is the period of what we can call the German Renaissance. It was this extraordinary flourishing of letters and philosophy in Germany, and Coleridge became the key transmitter between German thought, literature, and philosophy, and the whole English-speaking world. So much of what Emerson, for example, in America knows about German philosophy is coming via Coleridge, and partly because of this trip to Germany. Anyway, he comes back and he has a rather complicated career afterwards, largely as a result of the opium addiction. So, of course, in an age without aspirin, opium, laudanum, was used as a painkiller. So this was given to Coleridge as a young boy, and he became, of course, increasingly dependent upon it. And of course, people at the time didn't understand what we now would recognize as the process of addiction. So he has this, he's able to live on the basis of this annuity from the Wedgwoods, but his life is descending into increasing chaos. He falls out with Wordsworth. There's a period where he feels utterly betrayed by Wordsworth, but eventually he starts to write and publish. So the Biographia Literaria, and then later his work Aids to Reflection, is part of this this productive period towards the end of his life, when he's living in Highgate with the surgeon Gilman, who's actually, as a doctor, helping him to cope with his addiction. Now, you mentioned the Mariner poem, and of course the Mariner is an ancient image of the soul. So here's a very early notebook reference from Coleridge. He says, "I would compare the human soul to a ship's crew cast on an unknown island. Suppose the shipwrecked man stunned and for many weeks in a state of idiocy or utter loss of thought and memory, and then gradually awakened." So here's this sense of the soul as being like a shipwrecked man, stunned. And of course, this is hardly surprising from the parson's son from the West Country, growing up with seafaring tales, but also with this profound sense of the holy, the supernatural, and the struggle between good and evil. Now, there are a couple of points I want to make about his philosophy, which is a very important part of his writing, and that's his Platonism. So Coleridge is part of a revival of Platonism at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century that is very significant. So we find this in particular with figures like Thomas Taylor, the pagan, we would know as Thomas Taylor the pagan, who had great influence on other figures like Blake, in Keats, in Shelley. So many of these great figures were profoundly influenced by a revival of Platonism that we find in this period. And a 20th century philosopher called John Stuart made a distinction, which I think is rather helpful, between what he calls personal and traditional Platonism. And by this he means the difference between someone who is a Platonist by conviction, without necessarily being familiar with the explicit doctrines and terminology of the Platonic school, and then someone who is immersed in that world. Now, Wordsworth, I would say, is the former. So Wordsworth is a kind of personal Platonist, in which his Platonism is of a rather intuitive kind, whereas Coleridge is of the latter. So he's this deeply learned man. In fact, Arthur Hilary Armstrong, who's the translator and editor of Plotinus, the great Neoplatonist, in the Loeb edition, uses some of Coleridge's textual emendations for Plotinus. So in fact, he follows some of Coleridge's suggestions. So Coleridge was a very serious philologist, but he's not just a scholar, say, he's very concerned with ideas. He has a theory of the mind, a theory of nature, an ethics, and a theory of the state. Now, John Stuart Mill said that Victorian Englishmen are either Coleridgians or Benthamites. Now, what did he mean by that? He meant Victorian Englishmen are either Benthamites in the sense that they are utilitarians and mechanists, right? So they think that the world should be understood in mechanistic terms. What are we but material objects in a world that can be understood basically mechanically in terms of push and shove? Or they are Coleridgians, or Mill said the Germano-Coleridgian party, which has a different view of the human being, which is non-utilitarian, which has a sense of value as being something embedded in the universe rather than something that we just project onto it. And the idea that we cannot understand reality in purely mechanistic or utilitarian terms. So there are, for example, certain intrinsic values which are significant regardless of any particular prudential considerations, of any particular utilities. So this was Mill's assessment that Coleridge was one of the key figures in his own age. Now, let me give you another quote from Coleridge. This is from his work Aids to Reflection, which was first published in 1825, so in this late period where he's living in Highgate. He says, "Strongest impressions of novelty are the fruits of genius, while it rescues the stalest and most admitted truths from the impotence caused by the circumstance of their universal admission. Truths of all others the most awful and mysterious, yet being at the same time of universal interest, are too often considered as so true that they lose all power of truth and lie bedridden in the dormitory of the soul, side by side with the most despised and exploded errors." Now that's part of this conservative side of Coleridge, in the sense that it's the prerogative of genius for him to illuminate and reawaken certain truths, of all others the most awful and mysterious, that have lost the power of truth through being caught in the dormitory of the soul. along with a lot of errors. So he doesn't court originality. He doesn't see the philosopher as being primarily the thinker of new thoughts, but in a sense as this having this reawakening function. Now, ironically, he was, of course, extremely original, despite the fact he wasn't claiming to be. So, for example, many coinages come from Coleridge. So words like self-conscious or psychosomatic, scientist, these are Coleridge's coinages. So here's a man who on the one hand sees himself as a retriever of tradition, and yet for him tradition is a living thing. So tradition for Coleridge is not a matter of worshipping the ashes, but of keeping the flame alive. Now, part of this Platonism is the insistence upon the centrality of the mind, and the idea of the mind as being an ineluctable part of the philosophical exercise. When I was an undergraduate in Oxford a number of decades ago, most philosophers were sure that the problem of consciousness was something that was going to be solved around the corner. So in a few years, we'll have a philosophical theory that will explain away the mystery of the I am perspective, the fact that we all have a particular perspective on the world, which science, looking at the world from the it is perspective, cannot capture. So what is this blooming, buzzing experience of the world that we call consciousness? And how does that relate to the grey matter between our ears? How does that experience of the world relate to the synapses and the neurons firing? Well, in the 80s, philosophers were pretty sure this was going to be solved pretty quickly. Of course, that hasn't happened, and that's been referred to quite recently by a philosopher as the hard problem of consciousness. Well, the Platonist, since Plato himself, has always thought that know thyself and the exploration of the mystery of consciousness is at the heart of the philosophical endeavor. And this is what Coleridge says about Plato. He says, Plato began in meditation, thought deeply within himself of the goings-on in his mind and the powers that were in that mind, and conceived to himself of how this could be, and, if it were, what must the necessary results and agencies of it, and then looked abroad to ask if this were a dream, or whether it were a revelation from within and a waking reality. Note that the subtitle of Kubla Khan is a fragment of the dream. He employed his observation as an interpreter of this meditation, equally free from the fanatic who abandons himself to the wild workings of the magic cauldron of his brain, mistaking every form of delirium for reality, and from the cold sensualist who looks at death as the alone real life of the world, by not considering that the very object was seen to him only by the seeing powers, and what a little further consideration would have led him to deduce, and that which could make him see it must be an agent and a power like his own, whilst that which was merely seen, which was pure passive, could have no other existence than what arose out of an active power that had produced it. So that is his account of Plato as meditating on the powers of the mind, and indeed the depths below and redigative of all consciousness, right? So Coleridge says, like explicitly, long before Freud, how much lies below man's consciousness. Of course, partly this was fueled by his own opium addiction, partly by the terrible dreams that he was suffering from as a result of the laudanum. So, philosophically, he's interested in the question of mind in the way that the Benthamites are not. So the Benthamites are just looking at the world as a set of material facts, the legacy of the Cambridge Platonists. So a group of philosophers, Benjamin Whichcote, 1609 to 1803, who's often thought to be the leader of the group, Rafe Cudworth, 1617 to 1688, Henry Moore, 1614 to 1687, and the remarkably named John Smith, 1618 to 1652, but in many ways the most elegant writer. Now, these are a school of Platonists that were very important for Coleridge, and indeed these are philosophers from whom we have terms like the philosophy of religion, monotheism, Cartesianism, materialism. These were all words that were shaped by the Cambridge Platonists, and they were part of this English Platonic tradition that I think in this country, in these islands, sadly, we've forgotten about, and yet it's part of our inheritance. I'll give you an example of this in Spenser's Hymn to Heavenly Beauty. Fair is the heaven where happy souls have place in full enjoyment of felicity, whence they do still behold the glorious face of the divine eternal majesty. More fair is that where those ideas on he enranged be, which Plato so admired, and pure intelligences from God inspired. Thus these in flair, each other far excelling, as to the highest they approach more near, yet is that highest far beyond all telling, fairer than all the rest which there appear. Though all their beauties joined together were, how can then mortal tongue hope to express the image of such endless perfectness? Or Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. Look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb which thou beholdst, but in this motion like angels sing, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubims. Such harmony is in immortal souls, but whilst this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it. So there in Spenser and in Shakespeare, you have this tradition of Renaissance Platonism coming from Ficino and Pico, and then transmitted via the French poets and others, and the Cambridge Platonists are the inheritors of that, and Coleridge too. And one aspect of this Platonism is a distinction that Coleridge makes between what he calls reason and understanding. So he thinks that we employ what he calls understanding, which is our discursive reasoning capacity, right? And that is what we share with other animals. That is a capacity to negotiate the world, albeit differently from animals, because of course we're linguistic creatures, because we're conceptual creatures, so we can carve up the world in a way which an animal can't. But we also have the capacity for intellectual intuition. And here he often quotes Plotinus, who in the 5th book of the 5th Ennead, speaking of the highest and intuitive knowledge as distinguished from the discursive, or in the language of Wordsworth, the vision and faculty divine. Well, what does he mean by that? He means that we as human beings have this capacity to engage with the divine intellect, with the transcendent ideas. And we behold intuitively these ideas, goodness, truth, and beauty. And this is linked to his aesthetics, where he thinks that beauty is not just a sense of ornament, but the aesthetics is that realm which is translucent to transcendent beauty. So again, there's a Platonic background to this that I can only mention very briefly in relation to the idea of the symbol. And again, this is another wonderful passage from Coleridge. Palpatina philosophia in palpatinum religionem ducit. A hunger-bitten and idealist philosophy naturally produces a starveling and comfortless religion. It is among the miseries of the present age that it recognizes no medium between literal and metaphorical. Faith is either to be buried in the dead letter, or its name and honors usurped by a counterfeit product of the mechanical understanding, in which the blindness of self-complacency confounds symbols with allegories. Now, an allegory is but a translation of abstract notions into picture language, which is itself nothing but an abstraction from the object of the senses, the principle being more worthless even than its phantom proxy, both alike unsubstantial and the former shapeless to boot. On the other hand, a symbol, ho estin e tautogorikon, is characterized by the translucence of the special in the individual, or of the general in the especial, or of the universal in the general. Above all, by the translucence of the eternal through and in the temporal. It always partakes of the reality it renders intelligible, while it enunciates the whole, abides itself as a living part in that unity of which it is the representative. Now, here this distinction between the allegorical and the symbolic, which Coleridge describes as the tautogorical, had a huge influence on the continent, because the German philosopher Schelling picked this up, and he thanks der geniale Britte, the genial or Briton of genius, who gave him this idea that the symbol is tautogorical. That is, the symbol expresses itself. The symbol is the embodiment of transcendence, while at the same time pointing beyond itself. Unlike the allegorical, which is literally that which is saying something other than itself. So that is to say that in the symbol, so this is Coleridge's theory, that the symbol is the expression of transcendence, but not in the sense that it is divorced from that transcendent source that it is articulating. Whereas he's contrasting this with the allegory, which is, as it were, is cut off from that which it is referring to. So now this theory, this notion of the symbolic realm, the power of symbols as being expressions of transcendence, not airy abstractions, not remote pictures, but the living encounter with the sacred. This was a very significant part of his legacy. And John Henry Newman, the great Catholic thinker, recognized Coleridge's genius in this respect as much as John Stuart Mill. Although he was somewhat critical. He said of Coleridge, he was a very original thinker who, while he indulged in a liberty of speculation that no Christian can tolerate, and advanced conclusions which were often heathen rather than Christian, yet after all he instilled a higher philosophy into inquiring minds than they had hitherto accustomed to accept. So you can see how both Mill and Newman, from very different perspectives, were recognizing Coleridge as the vehicle of a manner of philosophizing, of a philosophy that was both transcendental and transcendent. I'll come to that distinction in the discussion, if you wish, that was much needed in Britain that, as today, was suffocating under empiricism and utilitarianism. Now, he also has a theory of the state, which is linked to this philosophy. And this philosophy of the state was in many ways organic. So again, this critique of the idea of the state as founded upon contract, which he saw as basically this mechanistic utilitarian model, he wanted to present this organic view of society as grounded in a necessary tension between what he calls the principles of permanence and progression. Now, this also gives him one might say, a radical aspect to his thought, particularly in the context of utilitarianism, where he criticizes utilitarians by observing that persons are not things. Right? So he criticizes Malthusian politicians by observing that whereas things find their level, persons are not things, and man does not find his level. Neither in body nor soul does man find his level. After a hard and calamitous season during which the 1,000 wheels of some vast manufactory had remained silent as a frozen waterfall, be it that plenty has returned and that trade has once more become brisk and stirring, go ask the overseer, question the parish doctor, whether the workman's health and temperance, with the staid and respectful manners best taught by inward dignity of self-conscious support, have found their level again. Alas, I have more than once seen a group of children in Dorsetshire during the heat of the dog days, each with his little shoulders up to its ears and its chest pinched inward, the very habit and fixture, as it were, that had been impressed on their frames by their former ill-fed, ill-clothed and unfueled winters, but as with the body, so still worse with the mind. So here he was writing in support of Sir Robert Peel's bill to reduce the working hours of children in the cotton factories, and part of a critique of a certain utilitarianism, based on one of his favourite biblical passages, Proverbs 29:18, where there is no vision, a people perisheth. And this is really where the idea of the clerisy comes in. So this is an idea of education which has influenced figures like Matthew Arnold, Leavis, T.S. Eliot. But his idea of the clerisy it's of course linked to the idea of the clergy, but he's really talking about schoolmasters, dons, those who are there to educate the nation. They're sort of, we might say, state-funded Brahmins, really. And it's linked again to an idea of freedom, where he says he thinks that freedom, and again, this is a profoundly philosophical point, but we shouldn't think of freedom as I. Berlin used to put it, in negative terms, but we have to think of freedom in its positive dimension. So to be free for a human being is to realize certain possibilities. Now, his friend, his old radical utopian friend, Thirlwall, once said that he did not believe in influencing a child until the age of, quote, discretion or choice. Coleridge said he showed Thirlwall his overgrown garden full of weeds and said, "This is my botanic garden." When Thirlwall challenged him, Coleridge said, "Well, it's unfair to prejudice the soil towards roses and strawberries." So the idea of the clerisy is fueled by this idea that there is a proper understanding of freedom, and this idea of freedom is incompatible with this utilitarian mechanistic model of the human being. But it's also tied up with his sense of human suffering and frailty. And after the death of Coleridge, Wordsworth wrote, "Nor has the rolling year twice measured from sign to sign its steadfast course, since the mortal power of Coleridge was frozen at its marvellous source." Charles Lamb, who described Coleridge as an archangel slightly damaged, gives us a wonderful reminiscence of the schoolboy Coleridge at Christ's Hospital, one that makes you wonder how little Sam would have fared with contemporary pedagogical aims and objectives. And this is his description of little Sam. "Come back into memory, like as thou wert in the day spring of thy fancies, with hope like a fairy column before thee, the dark pillar not yet turned. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, logician, metaphysician, bard. How I have seen the casual passer through the cloisters stand still, entranced with admiration, while he weighed the disproportion between the speech and the garb of the young Mirandula." That's a reference to the great Renaissance Pico. "To hear thee unfold in thy deep and sweet intonations the mysteries of Iamblichus or Plotinus, for even in those years thou waxest not pale at such philosophic draughts, or reciting Homer in his Greek, or Pindar, while the walls of the old grey friars re-echoed to the accents of the inspired charity boy." Wonderful passage. A logician, metaphysician, bard, an archangel slightly damaged. Yes, but in our bureaucratized, managerial, utilitarian world, his, I would say, is still a much needed vision.
So, question. I'm going to throw it over to the floor. I have one question though. I think he coined the word clerisy, and he liked the idea of clerisy, but we sort of have a clerisy now, don't we? And it's terrible, and everyone hates it. I mean, it's sort of, a clerisy is...
About whom are you speaking?
It's sort of journalists and, no offence, academics, and it's a sort of post-religious ruling class who feel themselves to be morally superior and tell people to do. And I'm not sure it's exactly how he would have preferred the idea, but is that a fair reflection of the idea?
Well, that's certainly not his intention. And in fact, the bureaucratizing of the university is really shocking in terms of, all the nonsense about aims and objectives and nobody who's involved in research or teaching, I think, can take this rubbish seriously.
Well, I mean,
it's just kind of part of the bloated bureaucracy of the modern university.
But I mean, more generally, we do have a sort of cultural elites who sort of influence everyone's morals or believe they should be in charge of what.
Well, I don't know. I just think that's
sort of a heresy, isn't it? It's sort of stand up.
Well, it's certainly not what Coleridge is envisaging. The key thing for him is, what is education, which is, a very interesting question. And there's a signal difference between training and education in the humanistic sense. And obviously he's a humanist. by which I don't mean humanist in the sense that he's anti-religious, which he isn't. He believes in a distinctively spiritual aspect of the human being that can be educed, drawn out through education. And that's really ultimately what constitutes education. It's the fact that we, as Aristotle says, we have a desire to understand. And so there is no straightforward utilitarian answer to the question of why we want to learn. And in fact, many of the best results of research in the pure sense, or many of those results of pure speculation, pure research, have great commercial benefit. We can think of many examples of the discovery of electromagnetism leading on to the telephone or whatever. But it's this desire to understand, this desire to understand the structure of the universe, the world around us, which is key and which needs to be encouraged. And the difficulty at the moment is, I'd say, the rule of the bureaucrats, right, who have no understanding what the university is about and think that the university is just some organization like any other business, and so impose on it a lot of restrictive nonsense. So I'm inclined to agree with you that we're not in a very good state at the moment, but it does illustrate a point that Coleridge would want to make, is that philosophers have a much bigger influence than we might otherwise assume. So, for example, I'll give you an example of this. I was talking to a colleague who's a medic, and she thinks that she is dealing with the facts, and I'm in this airy-fairy world which has no connection to reality. And then she was telling me, well, what are you going to do about this enormous deficit that we have at Cambridge? Cambridge, one of the richer universities in the UK, is losing a lot of money and we've got financial problems. I said, well, we are just about to lose the sole lectureship that we have in Sanskrit, the most important ancient language of Asia. And then clearly she didn't understand what the significance of Sanskrit, but I forgave her that. And she said, but look, the trouble is that you humanities people don't take seriously the economic costs of the university. So I said, well, why don't we just get rid of all the diversity and inclusion nonsense, because that's pointless. We've got 5 fully paid, diversity and inclusion people in the university. We could get rid of them straight away and save a lot of money and be able to sustain Sanskrit. Now, ironically, again, this is the irony of this, of course, is that I was arguing to keep the single most important ancient scriptural language of the East. She was oblivious to that, but at the same time wanted to keep these diversity officers, right? And so we couldn't do that because that would be against the law. And by the way, she said, and you're a white male. Right. Well, and I think this is the sort of straitjacket that we're living
What could be more important than
yeah,
that?
and so I think the reason why I mention this as sort of Coleridgean is because, of course, the backdrop to the ideology is coming out of a certain French philosophy fueled by Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, who see reality, quite unlike Coleridge, in terms of power. So all of the world should be understood in terms of power. And so ultimately the revenge of those who've been marginalized and Derrida was from Algeria, was Jewish, felt very on the fringe of the French world. Foucault was a homosexual and had his own grievances about the power structures. So this sense of revenge, that you have to have this revolution in which those who've traditionally been in the margins can take over, occupy the center, that then becomes the key to this philosophy that is accepted as truth by whether it's the NHS, whether it's by the civil service, whether it's our university, and yet this has a philosophical background. Right? And I think, so there was the irony of my trying to defend the ancient language of India, and this lady saying, no, it's much more important that we have, have various mindless bureaucrats who have no idea about the university doing their business. So I think that I agree it's an alarming state that we're in, but I wouldn't agree with you that Coleridge's idea of the clerisy is problematic. I think it's a rich and important idea.
Well, any questions from the audience? Jaspreet, I'm going to ask you first because you were our first speaker, so I think you have the right to the first question.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that very rich talk. I'll ask, luckily, since I'm not a white male, I'm allowed to ask very traditional questions. So I've got two. One is, could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between Coleridge and Wordsworth? The particular reason why is because I discovered both quite early on through reading the Lyrical Ballads. The Lyrical Ballads was the book in which the Rime of the Ancient Mariner was first published. Was part of the collaboration between Wordsworth and Coleridge. I found it almost impossible to read Wordsworth for about a decade after reading that. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how they bounced off each other, how they influenced each other, because my first, I visited recently, and their relationship seems harder and harder to understand as a result of one's looking at what both of them produced, despite the fact that they were both, as you said, in their own way, Platonists. And the other question I have is, how would you sell the Biographia Literaria to laymen, whether or not we agree with St. John Henry Cardinal Newman on why we should be slightly cautious with Coleridge? I think it's an exceptionally important book, but it's very difficult to sell that to the audience here because it seems rather forbidding. So I ask how you would sell that.
Well, I'll start with your second question. As a great American critic once observed, what were Dante and Shakespeare doing if not thinking? And what the Biographia offers us is an account of literature as this plenitude of thought, as opening up this whole realm of the soul.
Could you explain the book a little bit, just the layman?
Which book?
The layman. Just explain it a little bit, to the background a bit.
The Biographia Literaria. Yeah. Well, it's as the title suggests, it's a literary history of Coleridge himself. So he's telling us really about the books that he read, and those books as friends really, and how they shaped his own life. And he's also explaining the link between literature and philosophy, which is clearly, I think, a very important matter. If I can come to your second question, the relationship between Coleridge and Wordsworth is intriguing. Coleridge, I think, had an unjustified inferiority complex in relation to Wordsworth. He felt that Wordsworth was the more secure, the manlier, and of course this is not terminology that we tend to use these days, or at least not in public. But that was his, this was Coleridge's sense that, and I think that he was conscious of his own genius, but he was also aware that it was episodic, unlike the creative industry of Wordsworth, which could produce a great poetic work like the Prelude and the Excursion. And so I think there was a sense that his own life had been blighted by weaknesses which Wordsworth didn't himself exhibit. And at the time of the great breakup, I mean, Wordsworth did accuse him of being a drunkard and a liar, and that almost drove Coleridge to suicide. So it's a beautiful but also very sad story of the symbiotic energy of these two extraordinary figures, but I think comparable to Goethe and Schiller and other instances of a highly creative, but in some respects tense relationship.
The man in the second row.
How does Coleridge compare with Emerson?
Well, when I first read Emerson, I was struck by how Coleridgean he was. And I think certainly philosophically, Emerson is deeply Coleridgean. Although there's a funny story there, because Emerson goes to visit Coleridge in Highgate, and Coleridge proceeds to launch into a diatribe against Unitarianism. And after a while, Emerson says, "But sir, I am a Unitarian." To which Coleridge says, "I know," and continues. So, yeah, I think there's a very deep dependence.
This was after he had obviously stopped being a Unitarian himself.
Yes,
Because he was a
of
Unitarian.
course, he was, yes, of course. Yes.
And how did the Unitarians feel about him leaving? Presumably, they weren't happy about it.
Well, the Unitarians
They
were
cancel him.
the Unitarians were the great avant-garde in England, and I think we would tend to think of these days politically as we tend to think of the Jacobins as the avant-garde, but of course the Jacobins in England were really a tiny minority, and really the avant-garde were the Unitarians. I mean, they were the progressives, they were the radicals, and Coleridge's radicalism, despite the liberty, equality, fraternity that he in John's Gardens as an undergraduate, his radicalism was really Unitarian in its early phase. And interestingly, he talks about his return to the doctrine of the Trinity ad normam Platonis. And he compares it to St. Augustine. So basically, the key to this is the ancient idea of the Logos. So the ancient church fathers, particularly in Alexandria, saw the link between pagan philosophy and Christianity through the doctrine of the Logos, which is there, of course, in St. John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, which is, in Greek, the Logos. It's rationality, it's intelligibility, it's a whole dimension of meanings that are lost in the translation word. And so it was through this idea of the Logos that Coleridge moved from Unitarianism to this very speculative, I mean, Newman was not always happy with it, but very speculative interest in the doctrine of the Trinity.
The guy at the back was... This woman, sorry. Sorry. Miss Gentry.
Yeah, it's fine.
Sorry.
I just wanted to ask you about the statement that you made about Derrida and Foucault.
Yeah.
No, it's fine. I don't like things. I just want to ask, can we really comfortably be satisfied about their, you know, ethnicity and social and sexual identity, and to just take that, to think that the way they deconstruct the traditional philosophy, and can we put it really simply down to their, you know, ethnicity and sexual orientation, and just be simply comfortable with that, or there is more to dig deep and have a look. What went wrong there? Why did they want to deconstruct things? What do you think about that? Why did they do that?
Well, they're drawing on an ancient tradition. I mean, Hobbes describes life as the bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all. So they are drawing, I would say, on an ancient nominalist tradition, both of them. So there's a big division in Western philosophy between, let's say, the traditional inheritance of Plato and Aristotle, which believes that there are truths out there, right? And these are basically eternal and immutable realities. And we grasp those truths more or less through a glass darkly, St. Paul says. And then there's another tradition which would say, well, we're these very frail, fragile creatures of nature. This is a tradition going through Lucretius, through to Darwin, up to Richard Dawkins, and in some respects the postmodernists, who would say, look, we're these frail, very limited creatures, and all we can know about the world are these dynamics of power. Like, that's really all that we can hold on to. And so that's an ancient battle, and I think anyone who believes, as I do, in the Platonic Aristotelian tradition must feel, with honesty, the worry that maybe the other side's right, you know. So it's not, I'm not being dismissive, of course, of one of the most brilliant writers in the French language, is Michel Foucault. I mean, we can't say that about Derrida, I'm afraid, but certainly we can say that. Yeah. And I think part of the problem with the legacy of Foucault was that he was writing with this sort of French sense of esprit.
Yeah.
So he's there to, you know, shock the bourgeoisie, right? So of course, you know, madness is simply a tool for the bourgeoisie to control. Well, anybody who's encountered real madness knows that that can't be right. But obviously there was a shock element to Foucault, and of course expressed in this brilliant language. And of course Derrida was a very learned man. I once attended his lectures, and I attended a whole series of lectures on Monsieur Heidegger, and he was reading from his lecture notes very carefully, an interpretation of Martin Heidegger. So they were both extremely learned, in their own way brilliant philosophers, but who have influenced Western culture, particularly via the US, right? So it was, I think, through the literary departments, particularly Yale, this has exerted a huge influence in America. And I think largely because of particularly American concerns, which are, anyway. So, I won't go into that anymore. But so, I don't want to be unduly dismissive about either Foucault or Derrida, but I think the legacy in things like, DEI and all kinds of assumptions in contemporary culture are problematic because their philosophical basis is not recognized as such. It's often just assumed to be a sort of accepted fact, a reality that everything is about power relations, and that, if we're thinking about, say, for example, men and women, that we ought to understand those relations as essentially issues of power. Well, that itself is a claim about the world, and it's, I think, perfectly reasonable to criticize it. And yet, if you do that in a contemporary university, you're likely to be cancelled, if not feel rather uncomfortable with your colleagues.
I think we've been away from the word issue. Sorry? we get plugged out. Anyone? Felix, I know your name.
Yes, thank you. I was going to ask, and this might just be because I was slightly late, but I was interested in Coleridge's views on the French Revolution.
Yeah.
How they evolved, and I guess maybe, I don't know, it's comparison to Burke or to other things at the time, and whether you have any connection with them.
Well, of course, he's like, I'll have to read you a wonderful passage here. This is from Thomas Love Peacock, from his satirical novel Nightmare Abbey. And there's a figure here called Mr. Flosky, which is based on Coleridge. And the funny thing about it is he clearly knew Coleridge very well, because it's a hilarious skit of Coleridge. So, tea, late dinners, and the French Revolution have played the devil, says Mr. Flosky. Tea has shattered our nerves, late dinners make us slaves of indigestion, the French Revolution has made us shrink from the name of philosophy. Sir, the great evil is that there is too much commonplace light in our moral and political philosophy, and light is a great enemy to mystery, and mystery is a great friend to enthusiasm. Now, this enthusiasm for abstract truth is an exceedingly fine thing, as long as the truth, which is the object of the enthusiasm, is so completely abstract as to be altogether out of the reach of human faculties, and in that sense I have myself an enthusiasm for truth, but in no other, for the pleasure of metaphysical investigation lies in the means, not in the end, and if the end could be found, the pleasure of the means would cease. The mind, to be kept in health, must be kept in exercise. The proper exercise of the mind is elaborate reasoning. Analytical reasoning is a base and mechanical process which takes to pieces and examines bit by bit the rude material of knowledge and extracts therefrom a few hard and obstinate things called facts, everything in the shape of which I cordially hate. But synthetical reasoning, setting up as its goal some unattainable abstraction like an imaginary quantity in algebra to the unspeakable benefit of the human intellect. And the beauty of this process is that at every step it strikes out into two branches in a compound ratio of ramification, so that you are perfectly sure of losing your way and keeping your mind in perfect health by the perpetual exercise of this interminable quest. And for these reasons I've christened my eldest son Immanuel Kant Flosky. So that's Coleridge's critique of what he sees as the basis of the French Revolution, which he sees as grounded in philosophy. And he sees it as grounded in a materialistic, mechanistic philosophy, which, like Burke, has corroded and dissolved the sense of the sacred. Because I made the point about his critique of contractual theories of society, right? So going back to Rousseau and Hobbes. So basically, what is society? Well, we're in a kind of agreement, and there are negotiations that we engage in. So a classic instance of modern philosophy is John Rawls, right? And that we have to think about society as this essentially rational negotiation between our interests, and let's imagine, for the sake of this rationality, Rawls says, the veil of ignorance. So we want to have a society where we don't know where we, be born exactly. We want a society that's going to have the right balance between, freedom and equity and opportunity and whatever. Now, Coleridge thinks this is a highly problematic model of society. Why? Well, in part because we're historical creatures. We are products of history, whether we like it or not. We are imaginative creatures, whether we like it or not. And at the heart of his view of society is a necessary tension between what he calls the forces of permanence and those of progression. And he sees this in a polar relation, right? So it's not as the the leftists would claim an antithesis, right? So that progress is always the rejection of the past or permanence. He says no. Any healthy society is necessarily constituted by a dynamic polarity between inheritance, history, tradition, and progress. Yeah? That's the reality, and the danger is that the utopians, and he's thinking here of the French Revolution, will generate unbelievable horror and terror by the desire to create a tabula rasa, to create a clean slate, to remove our history, to take down our paintings and our statues and all the things that we've been doing in Cambridge in the last few years, and to create this new society that has no history. I once said to my students, I said, to a group of my second year, right, in a fairly reputable university, I said, what happened in this country in 1660? And none of them knew, right? So we are one of, I think, only Britain, along with Bulgaria and Iceland, does not have compulsory history after the age of 13. The ignorance of our young about British history is just astonishing and terrifying. And the great Goethe said, children need roots and wings. So the way that we are damaging our children by taking away their sense of roots, because we are crippling their capacity to develop. And that's a rather Coleridgean thought, that society is grounded in this tension. And of course it's a tension between the interest of permanence and between the desire for progress. So I think that's key to his critique of the French Revolution. It's a critique of utopianism, which is linked not just to this positive account of the significance of history and imagination for human beings, but also his sense of human frailty. It's those who don't have a proper sense of human frailty who will say, like Stalin, you need to break the eggs to make the omelette. And they won't stop at the excesses to create that perfect omelette.
Probably only got time for a couple more questions. So,
Did Coleridge read Blake? Did he write about Blake?
He met him, yes. So they met very briefly, I think. And they had a common interest in, I think it was a Tulk, who was a Swedenborgian, who, I think this is right. He certainly met Keats, and there's a rather touching and poignant reference to the illness of Keats that he sensed. And I think he met Blake and recognized the man's genius.
Is there anything that can be said about visioning Blake and Coleridge?
Well, I would say the difference between them is that Blake is the more eccentric figure. And I think that's partly to do with the different education of the men. I mean, Blake was an autodidact, and Coleridge was highly educated. He was a Grecian, he was a top boy at Christ Hospital. He was at Jesus in Cambridge. So he's a highly literate, highly trained philologist. Blake is an autodidact. Also, Coleridge is, I'd say, more familiar with the great canonical tradition of Western thought than Blake. So even though they overlap in many ways, there are differences.
Right. Any more questions?
This is a question really about the influence of Coleridge in the middle of the century, and I'd like to go back to J.S. Mill.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the great dichotomy Coleridge and Bentham, which I think he wrote just after Coleridge had died in the late 1830s.
Yeah.
So some decades later, he wrote a much fuller, long essay on utilitarianism, where he seems to have sort of come down on the side of a modified, maybe more qualitative form of utilitarianism. And out of that, we got Sidgwick and then into the 20th century. I mean, is there an argument that, I mean, Coleridge obviously had a lot of influence in maybe Cambridge and Neoplatonism and the Oxford movement, but is there an argument that he kind of lost, if you were choosing one thinker that has been more influential into the 21st century, Benthamism is one?
Yes, I mean that was part of, I think, of what I was saying this evening. But in the 19th century, it's I think it would astonish many of my colleagues in the philosophy faculty in Cambridge to know that Coleridge is really the origin of the moral sciences in Cambridge, and that the moral sciences emerged out of figures like Ewell and some of the apostles, so that group of Coleridgians at Trinity in particular, but also F.D. Morris. So that's the origin of the moral sciences in Cambridge. And another figure who was in many respects deeply Coleridgian was Richard Owen. I mean, people sometimes forget that one of the most powerful critics of Darwin in the 19th century among his contemporaries was the most distinguished naturalist of the age. I mean, Richard Owen of the Natural History Museum fame. And Owen's argument against Darwin was straightforwardly Platonic and was coming out of the influence of Coleridge. And it was about the vertebral unit. So the thought was, and he was, as I say, operating as a naturalist, he's saying, look, if you look through the various species in the animal kingdom, you will see that these radically different species have the same archetypal vertebral unit, i.e. they all have vertebrae in a very similar kind. And that the emphasis upon radical contingency in the Darwinian account can't explain this bizarre convergence in the biological data that we find in the archetype that we find in all these very different species. Now that was coming straight out of the tradition of Coleridge and Ewell. So there was this influence in the 19th century that Coleridge exerted. Muirhead, John Muirhead, who was a philosopher at Birmingham and wrote a book in the early 20th century called Platonism in the Anglo-Saxon Tradition of Philosophy, sees Coleridge as this key figure leading up to the idealists in Britain and America. So there was a recognition of Coleridge's philosophical significance. And also the other thing one should say is that in Cambridge theology, Coleridge was a key figure. Westcott and Hort of Westcott, Lightfoot and Hort were both deeply influenced by Coleridge. So he's this magisterial figure in 19th century philosophy and theology.
Thanks so much. I mean, I think you've got a train to catch, and I think it's getting to 9 o'clock, so we're going to wrap up there. But we will be going downstairs for a drink, so feel free to continue the chat. And thanks very much, everyone, for coming, and big applause to